The United States just tried to pull a move that the world wasn't ready for. It banned Canada from using the dollar, not partially, not temporarily. A complete blockade of the dollar clearing system, the very arteries of global finance. But Mark Carney didn't flinch. He didn't negotiate. He didn't panic. In less than 72 hours, he turned what Washington thought would be a crippling blow into the most stunning financial counterstrike in modern history. The implications are enormous. The dollar, long considered untouchable, is no longer safe. The rules of global finance have changed, and Canada just rewrote them. By the time you hear exactly what Carney did, you'll understand why this story isn't just about Canada. It's about the future of money itself. Last Friday, the U.S. Treasury quietly signed Executive Directive 2026-147. The timing wasn't random. Friday evening, a classic Washington move to bury controversial policy when the press is heading home and the news cycle slows. But make no mistake, this wasn't routine. This was a calculated financial strike. The directive immediately restricted Canadian government entities, crown corporations, and even the Bank of Canada itself from accessing the U.S. dollar clearing system. Two names are critical here: CHIPS, the Clearinghouse Interbank Payment System, and Fedwire, the Federal Reserve's real-time gross settlement system. These aren't just obscure financial tools. They are the pipelines through which nearly every dollar transaction in the world flows. Japanese exporters paying Brazilian suppliers. Dollars go through CHIPS. European central banks buying treasury bonds. Fedwire. Dollar transactions are global lifeblood, and suddenly Canada was told it couldn't touch them. The Treasury gave Canada 90 days to wind down its dollar operations. In bureaucratic language, that means figure it out because we're cutting you off. But this isn't a minor trade dispute. Canada's energy exports alone generate over $120 billion annually, much of it settled in dollars. The Bank of Canada's ability to manage reserves, intervene in currency markets, and facilitate trade was immediately compromised. The Canada Pension Plan Investment Board, managing $500 billion for 20 million Canadians, faced instant chaos. This wasn't a sanction. This wasn't a tariff. This was a financial stranglehold, and the justification even more shocking. The Treasury cited Canada's trade deals with the EU, the CSA Commonwealth Pact, and a regional energy bypass project, claiming these activities undermine the dollar's role in global commerce. In other words, the U.S. used the same legal framework it has historically applied to Iran, Venezuela, and North Korea, now targeting its closest ally. The reaction in the financial world was immediate and alarmed. Larry Summers, former Treasury Secretary under President Clinton, called it the most reckless use of financial authority in U.S. history, warning that weaponizing dollar access against an ally destroys the very system it relies on. Kenneth Rogoff, Harvard economist and former IMF chief economist, highlighted the deeper problem. The dollar's dominance depends on trust. Unconditional, politically neutral trust, and that trust just evaporated. Janet Yellen, Emvin King, and top former central bankers all weighed in, signaling the same urgent message. The president was catastrophic. The dollar had always been untouchable until now. But while Washington thought it had delivered a knockout blow, Mark Carney was already 3 steps ahead. Within hours of being notified Friday evening, he called an emergency cabinet meeting. Finance, trade, natural resources, foreign affairs, the Bank of Canada, every relevant actor was in the room by Saturday morning. By Sunday, the strategy was finalized. Monday morning, Carney addressed the nation with a calm, precise, and devastatingly effective message. He didn't scream. He didn't threaten. He demonstrated with facts, numbers, and strategy that the U.S. had made a historic miscalculation. The dollar is not a neutral financial instrument. He said, it is a weapon, and weapons once drawn change every relationship in the room. Then Carney began to unveil his counterstrike, a 5-pronged plan designed not just to neutralize the U.S. move, but to permanently shift the global balance of financial power. First, he activated the CSF Euro settlement mechanism immediately, moving $98 billion in Canada-EU trade to euros the very same day. Second, he accelerated the rollout of the CXA Commonwealth multi-currency platform from 18 months to just 60 days, giving 34 nations a non-doll alternative for $2.1 trillion in projected annual transactions. Third, he announced the Canadian Dollar Internationalization Program, issuing commodity-backed bonds secured by Canada's oil, timber, hydro, critical minerals, and agricultural reserves. These aren't ordinary bonds. They are global alternatives to U.S. Treasuries, physical, tangible, and credible. By the time Section 1 closes, Carney had already turned a crisis designed to isolate Canada into an opportunity to redefine financial sovereignty. Central banks from Europe, India, and beyond were watching. Investors were paying attention. The world had just learned an uncomfortable truth. The dollar, for the first time in 80 years, could be challenged, and Carney had just drawn the map. The world barely had time to register the Treasury strike before Carney's countermeasures began to ripple across global markets. On Monday morning, as Canadians tuned into Parliament Hill, financial institutions around the world were already recalibrating. The Bank of England, the European Central Bank, and the Reserve Bank of India signaled immediate interest in holding the newly issued Canadian commodity-backed bonds. For decades, U.S. Treasury bills had been considered the ultimate safe asset. Liquid, reliable, politically neutral, but for the first time, a credible alternative existed. And it wasn't theoretical. It was physical, tangible, and backed by resources that no one could easily weaponize or manipulate. Oil, timber, hydroelectric power, critical minerals, and agricultural production. All of it now underwritten by a nation whose creditworthiness is unquestioned. Carney didn't just respond to a threat. He created a new pillar in the global financial system. As the week progressed, global analysts began to grasp the magnitude of what had occurred. Ratings agencies, central bankers, and institutional investors were forced to ask themselves a question that just weeks earlier would have seemed absurd. Could the U.S. dollar, the world's default currency for nearly a century, be bypassed? And if Canada, a trusted ally, a G7 member, a NATO partner, could establish an independent, credible system within days, what did that mean for nations that had relied entirely on Washington's financial infrastructure? The implications were immediate. European banks worried about political conditionality in the dollar system began exploring expansion of non-dollar settlement mechanisms. Emerging markets long frustrated by U.S. sanctions and leverage watched Carney's moves with something close to awe. But Carney's strategy wasn't just about issuing new bonds or shifting currencies. He understood that the psychological impact was as important as the financial mechanics. By hosting an emergency summit and inviting the European Union, United Kingdom, India, Brazil, South Africa, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Japan, South Korea, and ASEAN nations, he framed Canada as a leader, a defender against financial coercion. Every country invited had reason to fear U.S. weaponization of the dollar, and every single one accepted within 48 hours. This was more than diplomacy. It was a message to the world. Dollar dominance is no longer guaranteed and alliances matter. Meanwhile, markets reacted in real time. The Toronto Stock Exchange surged 3.2% in a single day. The Canadian dollar strengthened 2.1% against the U.S. dollar, its largest single-day gain in over a year. Investors were buying into Canada's narrative, stability, credibility, and protection against the risks of political manipulation in global finance. Traders on Wall Street were suddenly forced to reconsider positions they had assumed were untouchable. A hedge fund manager in New York admitted privately that the Treasury's action had triggered a chain reaction of reevaluation that could take months, if not years, to settle. Financial journalists scrambled to frame the story, but even the press had to acknowledge the scale of the miscalculation. Headlines like "Carney outmaneuvers Washington and Canada" challenges dollar hegemony began appearing in major outlets. Analysts emphasized that this was unprecedented. Never before had a G7 country been restricted from the dollar system by the U.S. and never before had such a swift and effective counter been executed. Carney had not only neutralized the threat, he had made it irrelevant. In Washington, the response was predictably chaotic. Treasury officials were on the phone to European central banks, hedge funds, and investment firms, trying to gauge the impact. Rumors circulated in financial circles that some US dollar reserves might even be shifted into Canadian bonds. The panic wasn't public, but it was real. A financial intelligence source in DC described the mood as controlled hysteria. For decades, dollar dominance had allowed the US to project power across continents. Carney just exposed the fragility of that dominance. And the timing made the move even more brilliant. By acting immediately, Carney leveraged the weekend lull in U.S. markets to execute decisions before Washington could respond. Every hour that passed without intervention strengthened Canada's position. By Monday evening, the world was no longer talking about the Treasury ban as a punitive measure. They were talking about Canada as a blueprint for escaping dollar dependency. Markets, governments, and investors were suddenly asking a question that had seemed unthinkable only 72 hours earlier. What if the dollar isn't untouchable? By the end of Section 2, the message was clear. Carney had transformed what Washington intended as punishment into global leverage. Canada had gone from target to leader, and the U.S., long accustomed to the unquestioned supremacy of its currency, had just witnessed the beginning of a structural challenge that could reverberate across decades. The ripple effects were just starting, and every central banker, finance minister, and institutional investor in the world was now forced to reassess what they had taken for granted. By midweek, the world began to realize that Carney's response wasn't just reactive, it was revolutionary. The Canadian Dollar Internationalization Program, CDIP, which had been announced just days earlier, became the focal point of global financial discussions. And this wasn't a small experiment. These were bonds backed by Alberta's oil sands, the third largest proven oil reserves in the world. Saskatchewan's potash, which accounts for nearly a third of global supply, British Columbia's timber and liquefied natural gas, Quebec's hydroelectric power, Ontario's critical minerals, and the country's vast agricultural output. For the first time, investors had a credible commodity-backed alternative to U.S. Treasury bills, a tangible safe haven that could not be manipulated politically. Institutional. Investors began moving capital almost immediately. By Tuesday, European pension funds and sovereign wealth funds were requesting allocations of CDIP bonds. The Bank of England and European Central Bank publicly acknowledged their interest in diversifying reserves, citing credibility and stability as reasons. Private banks in Singapore and Hong Kong quietly began advising clients to consider Canada as a more reliable anchor than a politically weaponized U.S. dollar. Even major hedge funds in New York and London were forced to adjust their models. The realization spread quickly. If Canada could execute this in 72 hours, what else could a determined nation do to protect itself against financial coercion? The implications were staggering. For 80 years, the dollar had been considered untouchable because nations believed access was guaranteed. That belief had allowed the U.S. to borrow at historically low rates, run persistent trade deficits, and project financial power across continents. But now, every central bank had witnessed a demonstration that access could be revoked without warning, and that a sovereign nation could respond effectively. Confidence, not law, is what maintains the dollar's dominance. And in one swift, orchestrated set of moves, Carney had shown that confidence could be rebuilt elsewhere. Meanwhile, the global narrative shifted. Headlines moved from U.S. Treasury bans Canada to Canada, shows the dollar isn't untouchable. Analysts, journalists, and commentators were forced to confront a new reality. Political weaponization of a currency is no longer risk-free. Markets once assumed to be stable under the weight of dollar hegemony were now rethinking assumptions. Carney had created a psychological shockwave as much as a financial one. By demonstrating that the rules could be rewritten, he forced investors, governments, and banks to ask themselves, what is the next currency? Safe haven? And who sets the rules in the new financial order? The next part of Carney's strategy involved liquidity. Within 48 hours, the Bank of Canada announced emergency bilateral currency swap lines with the Bank of England, the European Central Bank, the Reserve Bank of India, and the Bank of Japan. Total non-D liquidity available to Canada reached $340 billion, more than many G20 nations held in total reserves. This wasn't just preparation, it was a declaration. Canada was no longer dependent on dollar access. Every transaction, every trade, every reserve decision could now bypass Washington entirely. Carney had effectively insulated his nation from the very weapon the U.S. Treasury thought would immobilize it. And yet, Carney's strategy wasn't merely defensive. By hosting an emergency summit of nations with concerns about dollar weaponization, he positioned Canada as the leader of a coalition committed to financial sovereignty. Every major economy that accepted the invitation from Europe to Asia to the Middle East signaled alignment with a system where dollar access is no longer absolute. The political message was undeniable. The era of unilateral financial coercion may be ending. Carney had turned a challenge into global leverage, a defensive measure into a statement of power, and an emergency into a movement. Even the markets reflected the shift in perception. The Canadian dollar surged against nearly every major currency. Commodity prices for oil, potash, timber, and hydroelectric power began to reflect the backing of CDIP bonds. Global investors realized they had underestimated Canada's capacity to act decisively. By the end of the week, trading floors from Tokyo to London were discussing the same unthinkable idea. For the first time in modern history, the dollar's supremacy could be challenged and successfully circumvented. Finally, the psychological impact on Washington was palpable. Treasury officials, policy advisors, and financial strategists began questioning their own assumptions. How could the U.S. maintain the appearance of control when an ally had not only resisted, but outmaneuvered them in record time? The move sent tremors through the corridors of power. The notion of unconditional dollar access, a cornerstone of American financial influence, was under threat. Every decision, every trade, and every bond issuance would now be evaluated under a new lens. What if political intervention could change everything overnight? By the close of Section 3, the narrative was undeniable. The dollar was no longer untouchable, and Carney had shifted the global financial chessboard in Canada's favor. Allies and rivals alike were reassessing their strategies, while Washington faced an unprecedented credibility crisis. And yet, the full magnitude of Carney's counterstrike had only begun to unfold. The story wasn't over, so it was entering a stage where the consequences could redefine global finance for decades.